Okay, so we've had a lot of conversation today around supply chain. It keeps coming up, and I'm going to call back on some of the presentations. As we try to navigate this complex, ever-changing, dynamic marketplace, it's interesting that in things that are happening in the world from both increasing cybersecurity attacks, things like geopolitical tension, even climate change, how fragile those supply chains are. And most importantly, they don't just impact our organizations, they don't just impact our clients, but also actual entire economies. So thinking about that, as we go through and we identify, assess, and start working on mitigation plans for our risks, very much in the way I did when I realized we're the last presentation before lunch. That's not lost on me. We'll get through this. Looking at those three primary areas, how has that impacted your approach on global supply chain for your organizations? Start with you, Jeff.
So I have a question for the audience. And now we can't see the audience because the lights are looking right back at us, but just a show of hands, how many are actually engaged or involved in supply chain security in the room? Okay, a lot of folks. This is, we were talking earlier before coming on stage, is that one of the challenges that we have in supply chain security is that it's a cradle to grave approach to what are you securing, from the point of manufacture of a product all the way through the process of it being deployed in the field or purchased by an individual. There are so many different security elements that fall within that process, and understanding what those are. I'm just going to speak to the cyber piece of it, both in the commercial and also in the federal government space. There's mandates now that are being pushed to ensure that the integrity of those products as it's moving through the supply chain are managed effectively and efficiently, and those compliance standards now are being regulated through NIST as an example, and as far as the government supply chain space is concerned, now you're starting to see GSA and DHS start to set standards and expectations on those compliance requirements within the supply chain itself, just ensuring the cybersecurity side of the house is being managed.
Great, thank you. So Peter, same question. Looking at all those different factors, how are you modifying your approach to your supply chain security based on all of these evolutions that are happening?
Well, first of all, I'm based in the Dominican Republic, so supply chain is our lifeline in a lot of aspects. Everything we get is through air or water. So we are very dependent on having a system in place to mitigate those risks, right? So my approach is supply chain can be very overwhelming because it's a very complex chain that you have to control. A lot of part is external, which means you don't have direct control. Some parts are internal. So what you have to focus on is understanding the organization and understanding it well, understanding the interconnectivity the organization has in this chain of events, the dependency, what depends on the interdependency of what the different things depend on, bottlenecks, single point of failure, anything that can cause any dependency, and create cascading events. And once you start mapping that out, you start seeing priorities, because we cannot protect everything all the time. We have to focus on priorities, and depending on the source that create this disruption or damage to your supply chain, you have to adapt it. That depends on where you are based, where you are sourcing raw material, if that is the case, and so forth. And if we're talking about geopolitical impact, if we're talking about natural phenomena, climate change effects, or criminal cyber attacks, that will have a different approach. Now, secondly, sorry, I'm not going to extend so much more, is you have to put the same type of thinking to the source. You cannot just see a hurricane for what it is, water and wind. You have to see it for what it creates. And that in itself will help you protect these interdependencies and critical points. Just to make it, it's almost, you take a stone, you throw it on water, it creates rings of water. And each rings is going to affect something, critical infrastructure, your employee, your communication system, the port you're using, the supplier you have. Each ring will have its own effect. And then you have to see how that affects your operation.
Yeah, very interesting. You talk about the priorities. If you try to protect everything equally, you protect nothing. So Mark,
Yeah.
Looking at that, focusing your priorities, how has this entire process really impacted your approach?
Yeah. I'd venture to say Jeff asked who here is involved in supply chain, and maybe, 10% of you guys and gals raised your hand. I would, honestly, I would say that every single one of you should have raised your hand because of the impact that supply chain has on your business, whether you like it or not. That, isn't any more apparent than what we experienced in 2020 and how much it was such a disruptor with the standard supply chain and what we count on happening behind the scenes every single day stops happening, and then suddenly you realize the impact. Peter talks about the rippled effect. So the current global situation, I know that Mike and team panel did a really good conversation, had a really good conversation earlier today regarding the current administration. However, your thoughts are on that. The administration is either going to, and the disruption associated with the administration has a global impact, but it's going to either impact your business potentially by having a lot of nearshoring, right? It's going to compel you and your organization to bring manufacturing potentially near or onshore, whether that's here in the United States or, in Peter's case, somewhere in the Dominican. Or subsequently, it could cause more offshoring, whereas if there's impacts to the U.S. economy, it may force businesses to make decisions associated with offshoring some of that manufacturing, and all of that impacts the global supply chain and impacts that ripple. And it is so. I spent Roy and I we're peers. We have an overrepresentation of the city of Memphis, Tennessee. Roy is the Chief Security Officer for International Paper based in Memphis, and I was the Deputy CSO for FedEx for 20 years. Back to my original point is I don't think that most leaders, both from a security perspective and then maybe even potentially folks in the C-suite, truly understand how much the supply chain, what happens in the supply chain behind the scenes in the quiet of the night, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, or on its way into the Dominican Republic. How much just this cog and the importance of this cog impacts your business, and it could be potentially very disruptive based upon one specific little tweak of that delicate balance within the supply chain. That the imbalance of whatever it may be could significantly impact your business.
Right, and you hit on a good point in talking with the being able to show the value to the company. And to be that trusted security partner, you have to you're doing supply chain security whether you realize it or not. Every company has to take an order, make an order, deliver a product or a service, and then accept payment for that. You need supply chain for that. And we really, as security practitioners, try to future-proof everything that happens. Now, they don't care how the sausage is made. They just want to see it on the plate, right? So that's very important to be able to show those results, but we have to do that. So in being able to show those results and have these great opportunities. I want to kind of liken back, where's Chuck there? Well, I know Chuck was sitting over there, I saw the hat just disappeared. Really, the importance of relationships cannot be overstated. So let's talk about that. The relationships that you have to build, your strategic alliances, whether it's the public-private sector organizations, security organizations, meetings like this. Talk about the importance of that to your programs as you go through the supply chain risk management.
Me? Yeah. Well, for those who knows me, maybe not so many here, but knows that I'm heavily involved in public-private sector relationship, bridging the gap. There's a lot of time we take for granted that the emergency service will come and authorities will help, but a lot of time when you have disruptions in terms of large scale, some natural disaster or something like that, we have to establish those relationships, especially with the public sector, and not just take for granted that everything's going to get settled. And in our case, since we are very prone to earthquakes and hurricanes that disrupts all supply chain for our nation, public sector, emergency service, government is key for us to be able to plan, for us to be able to prepare for any disruption, and how that will be restored and how that will affect us. We have to talk to the public sector, we have to practice with them, we're doing a lot of exercises, yes, so we get used to working together. Recently, last year, we had a national emergency evacuation drill that we had 2.5 million people participating, and over 6,000 organizations evacuated on October 10 o'clock in the morning. And how that communicated and how we work together, how that kind of gives you information. You understand that the emergency service and the government, like us, have limited resources. And with limited resources, you have to understand you're not going to get the support maybe right away. So you have to take that in consideration when you plan for any disruption. And that just, what I talk almost like internal, if you have a supply chain that you order from China, you have to be vigilant what is happening over there, because that will affect you as well. So that is something with the authorities and public-private sector that we have worked a lot with.
One thing that the importance of the partnership is, and I'm gonna, this is gonna be mainly a United States related response, but I always say in the supply chain security business, it is really, really difficult to pin down and prosecute supply chain theft. And the reason being is it's really complex, right? If it got shipped from China and it's on its way to international paper and it gets stolen in between, who's the victim? Is it the shipper? Is it the recipient? Where did the crime happen? Did it happen in China? Did it happen on sea? Did it happen in the United States? As we all know, you really need a Loctite case in order to get a prosecutor, especially nowadays, to pick up on it. So the importance, and again, you do a really good job of talking about that, the importance of the relationships on the international side, but creating the relationships, especially in the United States, but it's applicable globally, right? It's such a complex, intertwining problem that the only way you can overcome it is having the relationships and being very comfortable educating a prosecutor, or educating law enforcement, or educating whomever you rely on to try to help you thwart or overcome the criminal aspect of supply chain. That the relationship is so important because of it. I mean, I kind of jokingly say if I wasn't so ethical, I would come back and be a supply chain criminal, because man, it's so easy to get away with. Like, you cannot get a prosecutor to. I mean, we've had tens of thousands of dollars worth of theft that was blatantly obvious who it was and what happened, and we just couldn't get a prosecutor to pick it up. So Roy and I are going to get in the business of hopping on trains and throwing stuff off the sorry.
So Jeff, kind of talk about your experience with that, with relationships in the alliances, because in your business, you have some involvement in that.
I do. And, public-private partnerships and strategic alliances are critical in our industry today. I can say without a doubt, and I believe my fellow panelists here would agree, that we didn't really have a good supply chain strategy 5 years ago in the height of a pandemic that basically crippled the globe when you look at it. As far as these relationships are both on the federal government side, state government, and private industry, those relationships are critical, especially in supply chain and what we're talking about here, because we're trying to keep from going down these rabbit holes of different areas, different nuances as far as how there is risks associated with the entire supply chain process. But it's also important to understand that having these interrelational opportunities to work with other agencies gives us real-time intelligence. It affords us the ability to be able to take and utilize our government resources to define where the potential risks are. And if you're not already pre-planning and staging for various seasons, seasonal issues are obviously everywhere. Do we have a great map of what that is and when it's going to happen? Well, it's not a flip of a coin, but we do know when hurricane season is going to hit. We also know that we have challenges that are unusual and happen at the last minute, specifically like the Baltimore Bridge collapse. That was a inshore issue that specifically crippled the entire East Coast as far as supply chain was concerned. So utilizing these agencies and sharing targeted intelligence is critical for supply chain to be effective and efficient in today's market.
All right. So the carrying on the relationship conversation, very few of us have these large organizations with us from a security perspective. There's a lot of required outsourcing. So, I've really moved into the world of third-party risk management because I rely so heavily on my partners, which may also be vendors, other people internal to the company to be able to support what I do. But that's a fine line between innovation and resilience because what are they doing with my information? How are they protecting my equities? So talk to me briefly about, where do you see that as, as a positive, negative, but really more importantly, what can you do to leverage it better? And I'll start with Mark, start with you.
Yeah, I think that the fact that, only a few you folks raised your hands leads me to believe that that there is a need for those types of relationships, Roy. So having it's a complex domain, to say the least. Creating those strategic relationships and bringing those folks that can advise you as a CSO and advise your C-suite potentially related to it is critically important. Publicly traded companies publish, at least here in the United States, they publish something called a 10K. They have to disclose to their shareholders what they believe their risks are to the business. FedEx does it, International Paper does it. So before COVID-19, supply chain risk was number 18, 17 of the list of publicly traded companies as it relates to identified risks to their shareholders. COVID-19 2020 happened, and that got up to 8, and now it's starting to trickle back to the teens again. So the recency bias is going away. People are starting to forget about the impacts of it. And having that trusted advisor, if that's not you, having the trusted partnership to bring that person in to at least advise you or advise your C-suite, I think is critically important.
Peter, what are some of your, where do you see some of the challenges?
Well, a lot of people have a lot of relationships, strategic relationships, but they do not train together. They do not exercise together. I've seen it over and over again. They might have a very theoretical walkthrough of a plan, but they have not stress tested. And I've done it for multiple organizations, and all of them have failed. When you put stress on, when you test the plan, as the famous boxer Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And there's some truth to that, because once you put some stress on, once you make it realistic, the conditions, then you really see if your plan is working, if your strategic alliance is working, if they are providing with what they are promising. Because having everything on paper is one thing, but making sure it works, validating those relationships and not just taking it by word to mouth is one of the key points for me.
Great. And we'll finish up with you, Jeff. Talk about again, the pros and cons of working with your third party.
I'm going to be the counterpart to third party because it is probably the most significant risk of the entire supply chain process, just because of the number of hands that touches a product as it moves from manufacturing directly to the consumer. And I say that with the utmost respect because I would say 90 to 95% of business today in the manufacturing space and consumer goods utilize third party as a means to transport, intermodal, getting product to and from locations. It's an inherent risk that I can recall, when you were talking earlier, I can recall 10 years ago that business resumption planning, business continuity planning did not provide context around supply chain management. It was not considered a risk within an organization. And today, obviously, that is at least one of the top 3 topics in any industry today. That's your survival mode. Without having contingencies in place, you work toward an opportunity that's going to potentially inflate or cause severe damage to your organization. So I can say in closing that especially with the PPP, the partnerships and regulatory compliance that's now being added to third party, especially in the government space, as I was referencing some of those agencies, that is continuing to grow. We're starting to see GDPR as a resource for compliance and regulation. ITAR now is also stepping in to ensure that the integrity of those third-party agencies are fulfilling the obligation that the U.S. government is demanding as far as how they manage their business, whether it be from a physical or a cyber perspective. And so there's some movement that's making waves in supply chain, and I hope it continues because the resilience of our supply chain, especially when you're talking about innovation, is it versus resilience or is it in combination with resilience, modified plus or minus by risk? How do you assess what you do in the supply chain of your corporation, your company itself, in delivering goods to the consumer? Great.
And I encourage everyone, if you're not having these types of conversations with your leadership, this is exactly what you should be talking about, because this is that over-the-horizon issue that's going to actually add value to what you're doing and what we do on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great morning. Thank you.